Real Life is written by two professors, in London, based in London, and they talk a lot about how, these days we're all going to live very long lives. We'll all live maybe to about 100 years or thereabout, very different from before, which means the pragmatic side of how long are you going to live, and therefore how do you pay for the years that you live? When do you retire? Everything starts to change. If you're going to live to 100, you probably aren't going to retire at 60 anymore. And so you can't think about career the way you've thought about it before. Like, one monolithic block until you're 60 and then retirement. It doesn't work that way. So that led to my first thinking around, hey, there's maybe 2 or 3 reinventions. It laid the seed or the foundation of saying, what's that next reinvention going to be for you, Maya?
Welcome to Reinvention by Design, the podcast for corporate leaders and high performers who know the world of work is changing and who are choosing to future-proof their career, impact, skills, income, and identity. Today, I'm joined by someone whose career is a masterclass in intentional reinvention, Maya Hari. Maya has spent over 2 decades at the forefront of global technology, including senior leadership roles at Google, Microsoft, Samsung, and most recently as Vice President of Global Strategy and Operations at Twitter. But what makes her journey particularly relevant today is how deliberately she chose to evolve beyond a traditional corporate path. After Twitter, Maya stepped into climate tech as CEO of Terrascope, where she spent nearly 3 years helping global enterprises measure and reduce carbon emissions at scale. At the same time, she was expanding her influence beyond an operating role, taking on board positions with organizations including Singlife, Axiata, Cipla, and Saint-Gobain. And now she's moved into her next chapter as chair and co-founder of Genie Health, a startup at the intersection of health and AI. What stands out is that Maya didn't wait until the end of a corporate career to start thinking about future impact, influence, and options. She began designing a portfolio of contribution across operating, governance, investing, sustainability, and AI at a stage where many leaders are still focused on one linear path. So this conversation is more than about career moves. It's about how you intentionally design your next chapter, how you stay relevant in a rapidly changing world, and how you expand your impact beyond a single role or identity. Maya, really warm welcome to the show.
Thank you, Karen. I'm excited for this podcast. I think it's such a interesting topic at such an amazing time in our lives and in where the world's at today.
It's so relevant for today. So Maya, let's dive on in. You were in a senior global role at Twitter, and I observed you in that role. You were in your element, operating at scale, influence. You had momentum, and then you made a very deliberate move into climate tech as the CEO of Terrascope. What was the moment, the trigger that made you decide, okay, I'm going to step away from this more traditional path that I've been on and do something fundamentally different? What internal dialogue did you go through?
Yeah, listen, thanks for reminding me. That's when we met, didn't we? The first time we met.
Exactly.
So I think that there is always a moment or a trigger where you think about your life and you think about the sum total of every job you've had, every person that you've met. Does that amount to exactly the legacy that you want to leave? And not to say that the operating career was not amazing. I learned so many things. I met amazing people. I had the privilege of working for lovely companies. I think the one thing that stood out for me at that phase in my life was I'm a technologist and enjoy being a technologist, but applying technology for technology's sake, or applying technology to interesting use cases. Social media was an interesting use case to be able to enable freedom of speech around the world with a platform like Twitter back in the day, or at Samsung, where you're sort of making mobility and smartphones accessible to everybody around the world. Those were all very interesting, exciting challenges. But there was this moment where I distinctly remember feeling, I want to be able to take technology and apply it to a space of purpose. And I don't want to do it in a way that is go work at a nonprofit, right? Even though there's nothing wrong about being at a nonprofit. It's very fulfilling. But I had this itch, I think, to scratch about being really ambitious about both purpose and profit, and not wanting to feel like you have to choose one versus another,
Mm.
but not knowing can that actually be done on a day in and day out basis. So in a way, it was a good sort of challenge I wanted to lay out for myself. But I think it's also not that it happened in a light bulb moment in one instance and I'm like, okay, there, I'm ready. I'm gonna go do something different. It builds up like most things inside. And I remember through COVID, there were two or three big triggers that actually led to a cascading path of decision making around this space. I think the first was, there's we were all in lockdown, and I remember going to a library and just loading up on as many books before the lockdown deadline was going to hit in Singapore, and I picked up a book called The 100-Year Life, and
Mm.
The 100-Year Life is written by two professors, in London, based in London, and they talk a lot about how these days we're all going to live very long lives. We'll all live maybe to about 100 years or thereabout, very different from before, which means the pragmatic side of how long are you going to live, and therefore, how do you pay for the years that you live? When do you retire? Everything starts to change. If you're going to live to 100, you probably aren't going to retire at 60 anymore. And so you can't think about career the way you've thought about it before, like one monolithic block until you're 60 and then retirement. It doesn't work that way. So that led to my first thinking around, hey, there's maybe two or three reinventions that all of
Mm.
us have in our careers. So what's that? It started the itch, it started laid the seed or the foundation of saying, what's that next reinvention going to be for you, Maya? The second
Mm.
thing that happened was I got really deeply in love with sustainability. I fell deeply in love. It was this as I have a daughter who's now 18, and the story is probably told way too many times for her liking, but she was struggling with what most tweens at that time were struggling with, which is the environment going to hold up? Is there going to be place on earth for me to live comfortably the way I live today in the future? Nobody's doing anything fast enough about this. And of course, I got into mom mode and said, oh, there's someone should do something about sustainability. I was already investing in this space, and I said, maybe there's more to do. So that was the
Mm.
second trigger, if you will. And
Mm.
the third was just thinking about how do I drive impact in multiplier effect. What's the multiplier effect I can unleash with this thought of purpose and profit? So there was these cascading moments, and I felt like I got to a point where I had to try something, or else I would feel stuck, right? And so
Okay.
that's how it laid out. So thanks to COVID for leading to a lot of introspection.
That's so fascinating, and it was all kind of cascading to that decision. And the shift was really from working on something that you're super passionate about technology, to really thinking, okay, how can I combine this with something that's meaningful, where I can leave a legacy, have purpose, but also be constantly thinking about how do I reinvent myself for my 100-year journey. Fascinating, really, really interesting. As you moved away and stepped away from that global role to be the CEO of emerging company Terrascope, what did that feel like in terms of identity shift? And who did you feel you had to become next? How did that feel for you?
I think it was very exciting and yet very, very contemplative, right? And
Mm.
I'll tell you why both of those. I think the dream was always to finish the operating career as a CEO. And so that
Mm.
was, it checked a box. Even as I moved and reinvented myself towards purpose, it checked that box of saying, hey, I finally get my shot at being a CEO and seeing how things play out and kind of controlling the destiny of the company. So that was really cool. I think the other side of it was I was going from big tech to niche tech, right?
Mhm.
And it takes two things. One is the understanding that suddenly you don't have the canvas of Twitter, which everybody's curious about. Probably a big proportion of people could use that product, know what it does, etc., to something that's a little bit more kind of narrower in its focus, you of course get to make an impact, but the number of people that are interested or engaged in the space that you're working in narrows significantly. And so I think that was an interesting one. The second thing was going from a very large company running a very large organization to sort of saying, okay, roll up sleeves and get to it. It was a corporate backed venture, but it still was an early stage company. And so you go from running, a very large organization that's global to, 100-person company, which is a big shift, right?
Yeah.
The reason I say it is because a lot of people in those days asked me, they're like, oh, I didn't expect that you would be okay running that's a smaller team, a smaller organization. And I think in my mind, it hadn't even crossed my mind to think about that,
Mm,
because it was really about the ability to really shape outcomes around impact. But it's an important question because anybody going through that journey is going to be asked that. That's the optics externally.
mm, mm.
And I think what I told myself is it is a real test of a leader's ego,
Yeah.
is whether that hurts or it doesn't hurt, right? And we joke about it, but when you talk a lot about identity, ego
Yeah.
is very much a part of that identity story, and
Very intertwined.
mastering that is going to be real, right? And so I think what I stepped back and smiled, and I always go back and talk to my husband about many of these things, and I smiled and I told him, I said, it seems to bother people that they think I wouldn't have done this change, right? But actually, it was the most empowering thing ever, because
Mm,
the size of the organization ultimately could grow, could shrink, but actually, are you spending time? For me, the currency was, am I spending my time on something that truly aligned my purpose to my work?
yeah.
And there really felt like nothing else at that moment I would rather do. And
Yeah.
so it was just a joy in that sense, but it not without the adjustments. So I thought it was an interesting learning, even for me, to kind of think about how
So it's
identity worked in those
yeah,
changes.
it sounds like you had to adjust to other people's expectations of what you should be doing, and even though it was a CEO role
Yeah,
and in something that you were super passionate about, where you could really move the needle,
yeah,
some people would look at that differently, and
and
yeah.
different strokes for different folks. No, no questions at all. But it was interesting conversations that came out of that.
I'm sure, I'm sure. And were the things that you underestimated about moving from, global corporate environment, what you've said, obviously from, more resources into a startup, which is perhaps less known, more niche, but also one that's solving such a complex, urgent problem?
I thought that the two interesting things. I thought the expectation of impact did not need to be held back at all because of the size of the company. It was actually really interesting because we were at the forefront of innovation and purpose in that space. We were essentially building a technology company using machine learning to be able to measure and find ways to decarbonize large enterprise supply chains. It felt like I could go have this conversation just as easily in that new world with the boards of large companies or the CEOs of large companies, and there was room and space for that. And there wasn't just kind of, because there's a thirst for innovation, and so being niche tech did not impede
Mm,
access or did not impede kind of the ambition needed to have. The thing that is sometimes quite real is um, the kind of talent you're used to working with,
yeah.
right? And suddenly, when you're a smaller company or you're playing in a niche space, it may not necessarily, the same company may not necessarily appeal to all of the wonderful talent you worked with in your last company that you'd like to work
Mm,
with. But it does become something where the question asked of every new team member you bring on is, does this purpose really resonate with you? And it only works when the answer is yes. So that was the big difference and the adjustment. It's not like, hey, I know all these wonderful people, let me go bring them to the team. It's like, not everybody is a great fit for this, and this is not a great fit for everybody that I worked with and loved working with.
it's important that the purpose is the driver.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if it
yeah.
was for me, it should be for them too, right?
Exactly, exactly. And you've said that in climate tech, obviously data matters, but storytelling, empathy, emotional intelligence, they really matter too,
Yeah.
which is very different kind of leadership from the more traditional tech, large tech, where, the focus is very much on, structure, control, performance, quarterly performance. What did you, in terms of your leadership style, have to unlearn to lead effectively at the CEO level in this very new space in a smaller organization?
I would say that the interesting problems to solve at that time were very different from the problems we were trying to solve in tech. In tech, very
Mm,
often it's can you innovate? Can you innovate fast enough? Can you go fast and can you unlock speed and agility and stay that way and stay competitive? How do you achieve hyper growth and yet maintain quality of outcomes? I think the challenges were quite different in the other spaces. Very right that sustainability could be perceived as very dry, boring, or threatening in its tone when perceived by most people. Dry because it's like it's always doomsday. Someone's always talking about the world's going to going to fall apart, which it does feel like that sometimes when you're in that space. Or hey, if you don't do this, uh, you will be perceived misperceived or perceived incorrectly, etc. So it's always kind of or it's very like, hey, the carbon footprint is this, the carbon footprint should be that. It's very dry, and
mm,
so it often doesn't appeal to customers, change makers, policy makers. So if you really need to drive change, you have to be able to take those same stories, but actually articulate them in a way that the recipient really cares. And so the I don't think I ever did as much research on storytelling analogies as I did in that role. Because every time I needed a new analogy, we would say, hey, this is the amount of carbon that we have avoided in emissions, and that's the size of this country's carbon footprint, right? That was the first level of proxy we would do. But very often, you tell people, hey, the hurricanes cause x $1 billion or $1 trillion of damage, and it doesn't quite sink in. And then you
mm,
have to sort of say, hey, that's equivalent of Tesla's market cap in that year. And then
mm.
suddenly people are like, oh,
Becomes real.
it's very real. So I think that was and I actually think that that's a great learning for CEOs in general. You should be able to storytell like that, whatever your business might be, right? In a way to present that story that makes others really sit up and take notice. But it was particularly important in sustainability to keep people interested, to really have people understand the cost of inaction in that space.
Mm. So would it be fair to say that you've become a master storyteller as a result of that experience?
But I'd say I have to work hard at it all the time. But yes, it's definitely a good muscle learned. But you can't take it for granted. I have to keep working on it.
Very relevant, very relevant. Let's shift gear and move more into your most recent reinvention, which is your latest move into Genie Health. And it's so fascinating to me because it really sits at that amazing intersection of health and AI, two areas that are, so rapidly reshaping how we live and work. So when I look at your career, you've moved from digital platforms to climate tech and now to AI enabled health. Is there something you feel that connects these chapters as a kind of a deeper thread behind the problems you choose to work on in terms of your legacy and what you want to mm, what difference you want to make in the world?
Yeah, I think the I sort of look at my career kind of like, all the way up until COVID or COVID plus a few years, and then everything after, being two different chapters. And I really think about how I use my time, where I spend my money investing in other companies, in founders,
Mm,
etc.
mm,
All now actually squarely sits in the let's get the benefit of both. Like build a great company that's worth building,
yeah.
but actually invest in problems that others aren't happy to solve, or that's really genuinely worth solving. It'll add value, it'll be useful. Not every one of these companies I back kind of is a huge success. Some are, which is amazing. But I think it's really important to be able to invest in that mindset that you don't have to be mercenary. You can be missionary, and yet you can actually build a great company and profits out of being missionary. And so that's a little bit of where the anchoring of my mindset in this phase of my career has been, which brings me a bit to sort of the health AI company we're building and I've co-founded. I chair the company. I spend half my time in the company, and I think it comes from the deep desire of having seen a lot of founders trying to build in health and build in health tech particularly. And there's a moment in time now where you sort of see the world's population aging, healthcare costs really escalating, and yet you have this super impressive technology capability in AI that has shown up. And we all have choices on which spaces we want to apply AI to. And I think health just became this natural space where we felt like there's just useful agency to be able to unlock for consumers. How do you
Mm.
turn the agency towards the consumer and say, actually, you own all your data, use the power of AI safely, securely, with privacy in mind, but unlock insights for yourself so that you're not only going to help, you're not only helping yourself when you're sick, but you're actually helping yourself well before that.
Mm. It's such a critical area. And as you kind of look more deeply at health and AI, what do you believe that leaders need to understand about the next wave of technology and its potential impact on industries even beyond healthcare?
Yeah, I think for me, the big aha moment was, and we've worked in digital platforms before. Personalization has been a dream that we've all
Mm.
chased, right? And we've always said, oh, the cohorts, you build the cohorts get narrower, you get sharper and sharper with insights. But actually, this is the first time I would say the way we're building Genie Health, we're actually building for a cohort of one from day one. And you're building insights really only for this one person from day one. You're not starting with a large cohort and narrowing it down.
Mm.
That's possible because of generative AI. And now, if you take this and apply this type of insight to, other industries, think about the ability to think about personalization in many other industries, whether it might be how you price things, how you build insurance in the future, how you build
Mhm.
how you change manufacturing entirely in the future. It's just incredible how vast the impacts of change on industries could go, how far this could go is actually quite interesting. The only thing I think that will be challenging is the pace at which this technology is landing. And so often when I talk to the boards that I'm a part of or to CEOs I work with, the pace is coming at each of us so hard and fast, and we're having to learn and do at the same time. And that, talk about reinvention, Karen, that
Yeah,
is the pinnacle of
that's the
reinvention.
pinnacle.
it's
Exactly.
it's we used to always use this phrase, you're building the plane as you're flying.
And now we really are.
I mean, we should really question whether we were in the past. So like this really feels bad, right? So I think that's the interesting moment, and it's so relevant to what we're talking about now,
Yeah.
because the people who can own the most effective transformation of companies with AI are the people who are in the know of how a workflow is done in a company
Mm.
today, not a person who's a technologist who swoops in and says, I'm going to fix this workflow and automate the whole thing. But then that person who knows the workflow doesn't know technology or doesn't have the technology mindset, which means that they're going to have to personally transform and pretty rapidly, right? And so reinventing themselves and reinventing the human reinvention is going to be the story of this decade at least.
Exactly. And so reinvention is something that we all need to be concerned about as leaders and people entering the workplace. And I think many leaders are still trying to work out what this really means for them, because as you say, it's coming thick and fast and changing every day. In your view, and you're working with a lot of, big organizations on the board, what does it actually take to stay relevant today as a leader in an AI-driven world?
If I have to boil it down to one thing, change, it's still true. The old adage is still true that change starts from the top. So
Mm.
this type of transformation of a company starts from the transformation of the leader. And what happens if that leader doesn't move fast enough to transform themselves? That's the risk. And so what do I see leaders do today is you'll have one variety of CEOs who will roll up their sleeve, between
Mm.
9 p.m. and 6 a.m. and they're actually tinkering and building the next strategy for the company, co-creating with AI, thinking about how do you rejig your production lines, etc., etc. There are others who will say, where's my IT team? Can you actually come
Mm.
and sit down and tell me what to do? And I think it's the first architect rather than the second that is succeeding today in embracing. And if I boil it down, I actually feel like the leader of today has to learn by doing rather than learn by learning. You aren't going to a teammate and saying, actually lay out the learnings of AI. There aren't many yet. You're doing it and you're figuring it out. Um, there's also not courses you go to and say, okay, now I'm really AI proficient. And this is where it feels a bit different. It feels like you have to learn by doing. So the challenge I give most of the CEOs I am on the board with is often you build your first agent. I'm happy to be on a Zoom call with you and I'll build my agent with you. But it is really that first step of getting over the fear of
Mm.
doing. The rest is history. Once you know
Yeah.
enough to be dangerous, leaders are actually they're unleashed, right? And
Yep.
they can actually dream. It's actually being able to reimagine how your company works is really the ask with AI.
So the shift is becoming a different type of leader, one that is more curious, but also is willing and able to try, to
Yeah.
experiment, to put things into action, and not just to rely on other teams or education around the topic.
Yeah. At least for this moment in time, that's
At this
actually what
moment
it's
in time,
working.
yeah. And if someone listening to this podcast, feels, slightly behind, what's the next step that they should take in your opinion?
I would say, first of all, they've got to understand that the person that they feel behind to is hardly 15 minutes ahead. So there is
Yeah,
barely a 15-minute advantage that person has. So
yeah.
as a leader, come on, what's 15
We're
minutes?
we're all learning. We're all learning at the
We're
same
all learning.
time. Yeah.
We really are. I think the other thing I always tell people is actually when you roll up your sleeves and try something, do something, go for a small win that you care about, not a
Yeah.
use case that you think would be cool for the company. The first win should actually be something quite personal, something you is that's the itch that you haven't scratched yet. Why can't someone build
Mm,
something like this? I've been saying this is a good idea for decades. All of us have that one or two things like that, right?
yeah. A problem you wanna solve. Yeah.
Exactly. Take that and
Mm,
actually build a simple, small thing with AI to solve that. Because then you kind of feel like it was meaningful to you and hey, I can do it. And I also say try and get a friend or someone you build it with because there might be moments where you get stuck in a rat hole in the middle of AI application and you want someone with you there who cares about the same problem that can pull you out, right? But you can also be vulnerable with this person
yeah,
and
yeah.
say, man, I don't know what happened. I'm stuck.
I
Maybe you
think
don't tell a CEO and
that
say that.
that is
But
such great advice because, I mean, I'm an avid learner on AI. I spend, most of my day learning about AI. But it's true you can very easily get stuck and then not know who to turn to. So I think building with someone else
yeah,
and just trying, I think that's super important. I want to go back a little bit to one of our earlier conversations when we were talking about, the portfolio careers that you've built. And I regard that a little bit like building multiple streams of value.
yeah,
And what you have done is you haven't just reinvented yourself once. You've actually expanded into multiple roles across, operating, governance, investing. And this is a question for you. Do you think the idea of a single career path is becoming outdated? And if that's the case, how should leaders start really thinking about building multiple streams of value, not just income, but influence and impact?
Listen, I definitely think it's my reality, and I have realized that that's it suits me really well, Karen. And I think increasingly I see people going down the path of a plural life and having multiple things. But I'll give you two stories. The first story is really about why this actually works really well for me, but may or may not be the right answer for someone else, to start with. So, why this works really well for me is I've actually found myself to be a breadth meets depth person. And what I mean by that is I'm actually curious across many things. And
Mm.
I have these rabbit hole moments where I desire depth in many of these. And the standing joke between me and my husband is he's like, you can't do everything in the world, right? Like you just have to make choices and you're avoiding making choices. So, take that at face value for what it is. But actually, I really enjoy quite diverse set of things that I can go sink my teeth into and go deep into. And then I'm actually able to connect dots between these seemingly disparate areas. But my brain works like that, and I think it's okay when your brain works like that. The downside, even for someone like me on on an average day, is the context switching is significant, right?
Yeah.
And so the brain does hurt from time to time, and you have to be honest. So I think
You get brain pain, brain
you
pain.
do. Yeah, but it is really incredible to be able to think about the potential of impact, instead of an operator in one company, to be a board
Mm,
director across five and to be able to impact potentially in a small way the trajectory of a very large company and times five, right? And so that's how this works for me. I think the other story that I would sort of tell you is that for any of us thinking about, potentially plurality, I think it's less about career, it's more about identity. And I would argue that even career is all about identity. It's
mm,
it's getting comfortable with how do you define yourself, because going from a singular operating career to a plural career often, and Karen, you did a great job of introducing me with no hesitance, but sometimes people don't know what to anchor to when they introduce me.
mm.
Often introductions are tied to your title, and in this case, man, your
Very
titles are a
true.
mouthful because you do five different things. And so I think it really is about leaders. If you want to go down this path of plurality, it's actually how would you like to define your identity? And are there many things at work and beyond work that actually define your identity? I would start by asking that question.
Mm,
And the discovery of that answer led me to a plural career. And it's a
mm,
beautiful journey for anybody that wants to do that. And I mean, now you layer on the fact that you have AI reshaping industries. Pragmatically, it's a wonderful thing to be able to have plurality in the number of things you do, the number of things you can touch, because you can learn many things, but you can also diversify income streams. You can diversify how you spend your time. And there's probably
mm,
room for this type of world a lot easier now than before.
mm. Yeah, my observation is that you're in a very kind of powerful, authentic space where you've really learned a lot about yourself and what makes you tick, your sense of curiosity, the fact you want to make such a broad impact. And I love the way you've reframed your sense of identity to be so true to you and who you are. So I think that's very powerful. And it's a very powerful example for people listening to this podcast. So thank you for sharing all of those stories.
No, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. I have one question though about, it's a little bit about taking risk and it's about changing identity. But when people prepare for reinvention, it often requires moving before things feel like certain or perfect or, you know, not quite altogether there. Where did you find yourself, if you did, hesitating or holding back in your journey, and what helped you to move forward anyway?
It's a great question, Karen, and it's a very, very real question. I often end up, this is a question that I unpack together with friends every time they're at this moment of, is it time for operating career to be done? And I have some boards that have approached me. Should I not? And it's often that's the example that I come across. There might be many other examples like that. And I think for me the question was always, is operating done? Will I miss this singular operating career once I'm kind of done with it? It's one thing to say I have all this plurality. There's another thing like, do I miss it? Right.
Mm,
That's the honest
yeah,
version of that question. That have I asked
very
myself that question? Yes, a lot.
mm,
Will I miss it? Do I miss it? Are both questions that I've asked myself a lot. And I think where I netted out was actually getting to quite a comfortable place to say, actually, it's my life and my career. And if it's really true that we're going to live till 100 years, I have time to change my mind should I want to. And so
mm,
I found it very powerful to give myself a statement,
powerful.
which actually is that I reserve the right to change my mind.
I
And
love
I
it.
often tell people this too. And the more I've said it, the more it really feels that way. It feels like I am doing this now because this is how I enjoy living my life.
Mm,
10 years from now, if I change my mind, so be it, right? It's no different than, I would say, Karen, like I've lived in 4 countries in my lifetime. It's no different than saying, hey, I'm going to move countries. And it always feels like it's nervous, it's a risk that you leave behind some friends and family maybe, and then you're going to a new place, so you have some anticipation. No different, this is no different than that, right?
mm,
It's a different phase in your life. You're trying it out. If it works, great. I feel like now I'm in a place where it's kind of all settled nicely the way I want to. But in 5 years, maybe I desire something else and I might change, but that's my life. It's my choice. And I
yeah,
reserve that right. I don't want to be told by people saying, hey, there's a risk. You go to a board career, you can't come back to an operating career. I read the Disney CEO's autobiography at one point, and I remember saying, he's done so many cool things like M&A, large M&A, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, for a couple of days, I was dreaming like, which big company am I going to go run next? And then I'm like, oh, wait, I chose this path for a reason. But it's okay.
you
You
did.
got to dream if you want to, right? It's our
Yeah.
life. We got to
I, I,
make
I,
it.
I love that. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's how we should all think about it. It's our life, and I reserve the right to change my mind. How powerful is that?
Yeah. It just
Love
takes
it.
the pressure off, I think,
It
of
does. It does. It does.
needing to have everything figured out all for eternity.
Yeah. Maya, you mentioned earlier that, sometimes when you're thinking about, what next, you will speak to other people, people in your surroundings. And one thing that does stand out for me is how intentional you've been about the professional, the educational environments, the networks that you've put yourself in, whether it's, getting your education from INSEAD, board development, broader ecosystem exposure. How have those environments shaped the way you think about your career reinvention and just the power of conversation with different people with different points of views?
I think it's a very good question. It's actually a big influence in where you spend your time in networks and where you spend your time in education. And education is a proxy to learning, really, right? Which
Mm,
and learning is one lever of reinvention in a way. I think when I first chose to go do an MBA at INSEAD, it was to solve for one thing. It was that I was working in Silicon Valley, working in the US. The purview of the companies I was working at was still very US first, US focused, even though they're all global companies. And being someone who grew up in India and sort of came into the US, I sort of thirsted for truly global perspective.
mm,
I realized that, even though I was sitting in Silicon Valley, I was most interested in, sort of, at that time, the complexity of an American company operating in China, etc. So those were the problems I was getting attracted to even in the early days of my career. And so the choice of INSEAD for me was my own expression of that interest of wanting to be more global. And anybody that knows INSEAD as a business school knows no more
Yeah.
than 10% of the student population comes from any single country. So this was my way of expressing that desire. And by doing that, I fundamentally changed the trajectory of building a career more globally, right? And so I think that was an interesting pivot for me at that time. I think more recently, I've thought a lot about how do I educate myself in the governance space? How do I get myself more ready? And the education not only comes from, kind of book education or thought education, but it's also the kind of people you surround yourself with, like you rightly said, right? The networks
Mm.
you're a part of, you learn a lot more when you're in the moment of need where your board is going through something. Who can
Mhm.
without breaking confidence, ask some pointed questions to, so that you can learn how other boards might be dealing with some things like that. And for me, this came from Harvard, going to Harvard for board education. And the board education itself, the week I spent there, was amazing. But actually, it was the alumni that ended up being a community to me. Here are board directors in all the large companies in the world. Let's say there's some sticky matter. I'm like, okay, I need to talk to someone who has. So I chair remuneration committee, and I'm like, I'd like to talk to someone who's tried
Mhm.
this in remuneration, right? And there's a few people from big large global boards around the world who are like, yeah, we've tried this, or this worked, or this didn't work. That's the richness of learning, and that's the power of who you surround yourself with. And I always feel like we should be aspirational in who we spend our time with, because then that's the richest give back to us, in learning. So that's hopefully answers that
It,
question. But
it, it really does, and but I would say there are definitely people who may not be in those environments today who haven't built those networks for positioning themselves. How would you suggest that people get started if they don't have or if they haven't built that today, and maybe you're a little bit, you know, not so willing to put themselves out there? What advice would you give?
no, I think you've got to. I would always say be aspirational about the best
Mhm.
set of people you can put yourself in the middle of, right? Every one
Yeah,
of us, based on which country we live in, or what group we're part of, or which industry we're part of, our access is different. Each one of us has different access to different pools of people. But if you can be ambitious about the quality of people that you put yourself in the middle of, that's your
mhm,
best shot. It's all relative, right? it's
yeah,
it's your best shot of kind of learning from people who you think are operating in the circles where you aspire to be. um,
exactly,
so I think it's all
exactly.
relative, to be honest. It's not absolute at all, but I would just be ambitious there about what's the best option, and then just go for the best option.
That's very powerful. I want to talk a little bit about future proofing in kind of like a practical sense. So we talk a lot about proofing your career, but it can feel a little bit abstract. So what are two or three practical things that leaders should be doing right now to stay relevant over the next few years in your view?
I think learning by doing would be the start, whether that's
Mhm.
AI, whether that's, it doesn't always have to be AI, but things that are shaping our worlds at the moment, being in the conversations, being in the know, and not necessarily being stuck in a silo is actually really important.
Yeah,
Interdisciplinary thinking is really important
yeah,
for the world that we're going to. So how do you actually put yourself in that, like finding an agenda, finding a conference, finding a project that you can actually put yourself into that furthers that cause. I think that's one that's sort of a practical, first, no regret kind of move, I would say. I think the second I would say is the choice of companies that we all work with, associate with today. If you think about kind of this path and trajectory of reinventing, you reinvent yourself through doing work with
mm,
companies or with projects that you are spending time with. So the choice of who you associate with now is also quite important, right? Are you getting as much learning from what you're doing now as value, like compensation, title, everything else? And so I would almost say that learning and transformation is equal. So let's make that less abstract for a second. Today, I think if a technologist like me wants to play with AI, I would choose a slightly smaller company versus a very, very large company if I had
Mm.
choice, if all else was equal. Why do I say that? Because you probably have a little bit more freedom and room to change things
Experiment. Yeah.
in a smaller or a mid-sized company versus a very, very large company. Bureaucracy is the biggest challenge for AI percolation to happen today, right? And so if you had a choice, if all else is equal, I would pick something that feels a place where you will get more out of it, and that would be a huge investment in your future. So that's a bit of an example of the choice of where you associate and put your time today matters.
Mm. And having that learning environment. Yeah, I love it. Love it. Maya, we're going to finish off with a very kind of quick rapid fire round. So I'm going to ask short question and just give me short instinctive answers, just
Okay.
rapid fire. Okay. So first question, clarity or courage? Which mattered more in your reinvention?
Oof, courage.
Yeah. Second, what is the one habit that keeps you evolving?
I want to
Oh,
say rabbit holing.
what is one habit that keeps you evolving?
I think rabbit holing. My rabbit leads to my moments of inspiration that
Yeah,
then
Maya.
leads to my obsession, which is whatever comes next, I think.
Very interesting. And what's one skill that every senior leader should build right now?
I would say AI. I just feel like it's just going to change so much. So AI. I know it's a cliched one, but it is
But it's the reality.
really
In,
true.
in one word, what defines success for you today?
Oh, legacy.
Mm,
What you're remembered by. Will people still want to work with you at the end of it? Uh,
yeah,
will people follow you for the legacy you want to build?
incredibly powerful. And if you had to reinvent again tomorrow, what would be your first three moves?
Oof. Can I have a few years, please, before I read? It can be a bit tiring.
You've already done a fair amount.
Yeah.
It's okay
Plenty
to
of
take a
breaks in
break,
between
Maya.
everything. But first three moves, if I were to reinvent, I would say, is it worth spending my time? What am I enjoying?
Yeah.
And how do I do more of what I enjoy? Um, Check the ikigai box. Like, does it pay me
Mm,
enough? Does it make me happy? And am I good at it? So I do those checks first. And then I'll surround myself with people I enjoy working with. So the who matters as much as the what.
very nice. Maya, thank you so much. That was such a thoughtful and powerful conversation. And what I really take from your story is that reinvention, it doesn't have to be reactive, it can be designed and in order to leave a legacy. You've really shown how a leader can build multiple streams of value, leading to just that greater sense of purpose and fulfillment. So, to everyone listening, if this episode has resonated with you, please take a moment to reflect. Where are you being called to evolve? Where might you be building new skills, new networks, or new forms of influence? And what would it take and what would it look like to design your next chapter before someone else designs it for you? Because reinvention doesn't start with a big move, it starts with a decision. So if you enjoyed the episode, please follow Reinvention by Design for more conversations with leaders who are building new paths, new income streams, and new ways of working. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it. And what a fun conversation.